The little sedan coughed its last on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't a dramatic death, no explosion of steam or screech of tortured metal. It was just a weary, final sigh, followed by a profound silence as the engine gave up the ghost. For Eleanor, who was sitting behind the wheel, the silence was deafening. This car had been a gift from her husband Arthur on their 40th anniversary. He had picked it out himself, polishing the chrome until it shone like a mirror, telling her it was a reliable thing, a car that would never let her down. And it hadn't, not for 12 long years, even after Arthur was gone. Now, sitting in the middle of the turning lane, with a line of impatient cars forming behind her, Eleanor felt a familiar pang of loneliness. The car wasn't just a machine. It was the last big piece of Arthur she had with her every day. A kind man in a pickup truck helped her push it to the side of the road. He even waited with her until the tow truck arrived, making small talk about the unseasonably warm weather. Eleanor was grateful for his simple decency. It was a quality she valued above all else. At 67, Eleanor lived a quiet life. Her world was small, but it was full. It was made up of her small garden, the book club she hosted on Thursdays, the phone calls from her grandchildren, and the warm memories of a life lived with a good man. Her house was a modest brick bungalow, the kind with comfortable chairs, that knew the shape of their occupants, and a kitchen that always smelled of baking and brewing tea. She wasn't poor, but she lived simply, on the careful savings and a small pension Arthur had left behind. He had always been a believer in living within one's means. The mechanic at the local garage, a young man who had known her since he was a boy, delivered the bad news gently. The engine was shot. It would cost more to fix than the car was worth. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," he said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "It's time to let her go." Eleanor nodded, a sad smile on her face. She knew he was right. The problem was, what was she supposed to do now? She needed a car. She needed it to get to the grocery store, to her doctor's appointments, to drive the 40 minutes out to see her grandchildren on weekends. Relying on friends or the unreliable bus service wasn't a practical option. That night, she sat in Arthur's old armchair, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. The idea of walking into a big, modern car dealership was daunting. They were places of bright lights and loud music, filled with aggressive people in sharp suits who talked in a language of down payments and APRs that she found both confusing and intimidating. Arthur had always handled these things. He was a calm, patient man who could talk to anyone and never let himself be rushed. She felt a flicker of his absence, a sharp little sting. But then she remembered something else he used to say. "You've got more grit in your little finger than most people have in their whole body, Ellie. Don't you ever forget it." Taking a deep breath, she made her decision. She would go. She would be polite, she would be firm, and she would find a simple, reliable car, just like the one she had lost. The next day, she chose to go to Premier Motors. It was the biggest dealership in town, a vast glass and chrome complex that sat just off the highway like a modern-day temple. She chose it thinking a bigger place would have more options for a reasonably priced, pre-owned car. She parked her borrowed car, a neighbor's old hatchback, and smoothed down the front of her best cardigan. It was a soft, oatmeal-colored thing Arthur had bought for her years ago, her favorite. With her sensible handbag on her shoulder and her comfortable walking shoes on, she pushed through the heavy glass door. The inside was even more overwhelming than she had imagined. The air was thick with the scent of new car and overpowering cologne. Upbeat, thumping music played from hidden speakers. Under the bright, fluorescent lights, rows of new cars gleamed in every color imaginable, looking more like spaceships than vehicles. The salespeople were just as polished as the cars. They were mostly young men in perfectly tailored suits, moving with a predatory grace, their eyes constantly scanning the room. They were sharks, and they were looking for a big fish. Eleanor stood near the entrance, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. She felt invisible. She watched as two couples dressed in expensive-looking clothes were immediately swarmed by smiling salesmen, offering coffee and asking what kind of day they were having. No one looked at her. It was as if she were a piece of the furniture, a ghost from another world that had wandered into their temple of commerce. A young woman with a tablet walked right past her, her eyes fixed on a man pulling up in a shiny new SUV. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Eleanor simply stood there, waiting patiently. Her quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the buzzing energy around her. Finally, a man detached himself from a conversation with a colleague and sauntered over to her. He couldn't have been much older than 30, with slicked-back dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His name tag read, Rick. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone casual, almost bored. "Yes, I hope so," Eleanor began with a polite smile. "I'm looking for a reliable, used car. Something simple for getting around town." Ow. Rick didn't look at her face. His eyes flickered over her cardigan, her sensible shoes, and then toward the main showroom floor. A little smirk played on his lips. "Right," he said, drawing the word out. "Simple. Okay." He didn't ask about her budget or what she was looking for in a car. He just gestured vaguely with his thumb toward the back of the massive building. "The used lot is out back. You can just walk through there," he said, turning his body away from her already, his attention clearly drifting back to the bigger sale he was hoping to make. "I did look out there," Eleanor said, her voice still even. "But most of them have very high mileage, and I was hoping to find something that might still have a bit of a warranty left. I was told you might have some pre-certified vehicles." She was trying to use the terminology she had seen online, to show she had done some homework. Rick let out a short, sharp laugh and looked over his shoulder at his colleague, who was watching the exchange with an amused expression. "A warranty? Ma'am, for what you're probably looking to spend, you'll be lucky to get a car with 4 tires that hold air." The cruelty in his voice was casual, offhand, which made it even worse. "Come on," he said, not waiting for her response. He led her not toward the section of nicer-looking used cars near the back of the showroom, but past them, towards a door marked service. He led her outside to a small, sad-looking corner of the lot that was separated from the main used car section. The cars here were the true rejects, dented, faded, with cracked windshields and bald tires. He stopped in front of a compact car that was at least 15 years old. Its paint was peeling, and the inside looked stained and worn. "Here you go," he said, slapping the hood with a loud clang. "This one's more your speed. It's cheap, it runs, mostly. Can't really promise you much more than that." He leaned against the car, his arms crossed, a look of pure condescension on his face. He wasn't trying to sell her this car. He was trying to humiliate her. A hot flush of shame crept up Eleanor's neck. Her throat felt tight. She could feel the eyes of other salesmen on them from inside the showroom. They were watching this spectacle, this public dismissal. She looked at the pathetic car in front of her, then at the smug young man beside it. She thought of Arthur, his gentle spirit, his belief in treating everyone with respect. The anger she felt wasn't loud or explosive. It was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. This wasn't about money or status. It was about being seen as a person, as a human being deserving of a little common courtesy. Without another word to the salesman, she turned and began to walk away. The long walk back through the showroom and toward the exit was the hardest part. She could feel their eyes on her, could almost hear their unspoken laughter. She kept her head high, her back straight, focusing on the glass doors ahead. She didn't run. A simple woman doesn't run from disrespect. She carries it with her, a heavy burden that only she can feel. Stepping out into the bright afternoon sun, she took a deep, shuddering breath and got into the borrowed car. As she drove away, she didn't look back. She just drove, the weight of the humiliation settling deep into her heart, a wound as real as any physical blow. She had gone looking for a car, and had instead been made to feel like she was worth nothing at all. The borrowed car felt foreign and unwelcoming. Its seats were stiff, and the radio was set to a station with frantic, loud music that Eleanor didn't understand. She turned it off, preferring the quiet rumble of the engine and the sound of the tires on the pavement. The drive home was a blur of familiar streets she no longer saw. Her mind was replaying the scene at the dealership over and over. The salesman's smirk, his dismissive laugh. The way he had called her ma'am not as a sign of respect, but as a label for someone who was old and irrelevant. The casual cruelty of it all was what stung the most. He hadn't been angry or hateful. He had simply seen her as a waste of his time, a small obstacle in his day, and had brushed her aside without a second thought. When she pulled into her driveway, the sight of her own little brick bungalow was a small comfort. It was her sanctuary, the place where the world couldn't touch her with its sharp edges. But as she walked up the path, past the rose bushes Arthur had planted, the sting of humiliation was still sharp. She let herself in, and the silence of the house, usually so peaceful, now felt heavy and echoing. She went straight to the kitchen and filled the kettle, her movements automatic. The routine of making tea was something she could hold on to. It's a simple task that didn't require any thought. While the water boiled, she sank into one of the wooden chairs at her small kitchen table. The memory of Arthur was strong in this room. She could almost see him sitting here, reading the newspaper and sipping his coffee. His glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was a man of immense integrity. He had built his company from a single truck into a large logistics firm, not by being ruthless, but by being fair. He paid his employees well. He never broke a promise. And he believed that how you treated the people who couldn't do anything for you was the true measure of your character. He always told her, "It's easy to be nice to the big boss, Ellie. The real test is being nice to the janitor." She remembered the day he had come home, furious because he'd seen one of his managers berating a new warehouse worker. Arthur had made the manager apologize to the young man in front of everyone. That was the man she had married. That was the legacy he had left her, not just a comfortable life, but a set of values. The kettle began to whistle, pulling her from her thoughts. She poured the hot water into a mug with a picture of a smiling cat on it, her favorite. She dunked the chamomile tea bag in and out, watching the water turn a pale, gentle brown. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried at the dealership, and she wouldn't cry now. She was just profoundly sad. She was sad that the world her and Arthur had built, a world based on respect and quiet dignity, seemed to be disappearing. It was being replaced by a world of shiny surfaces and hollow people. A world where a kind older woman in a simple cardigan was invisible. She carried her mug to the living room and sat in Arthur's old armchair. The floral-patterned fabric was worn smooth in all the right places. She curled her feet up underneath her just as she always did and stared out the window at the street. A young couple walked by, pushing a stroller and laughing about something. They looked so carefree. Eleanor wondered if they had ever been made to feel small, if they had ever been dismissed so completely. It was a lonely thought. She wasn't angry, not really. It was more of a deep, weary disappointment. It felt like a fundamental rule of human decency had been broken, and she was the one left feeling the ache of it. For a long time, she just sat there, nursing her tea and watching the day slowly fade. She thought about calling her son, but she didn't want to worry him. He would get angry and he would want to rush in and fix it, but that wasn't what she wanted. This wasn't a problem to be solved with anger. It was a wound that needed to be understood. She thought about her next move. She couldn't give up. She needed a car. But the thought of walking into another dealership, of facing another salesman like Rick, was exhausting. It felt like a battle she wasn't equipped to fight. As the last of the daylight disappeared and the room grew dim, her mind drifted back to Arthur again. She remembered one specific conversation, a few months before he got sick. They had been talking about their wills, a serious and difficult topic. Arthur had been surprisingly emotional. "The money is just a tool, Ellie," he had told her, holding her hand in his. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear. "It's not the important part of what I'm leaving you. The important part is the family we've built, the people who stood with us. People like David." David, the name hung in the quiet room. David Chen. Arthur had hired him straight out of college, a quiet, brilliant kid from a family that had nothing. Arthur had seen a spark in him, a fierce loyalty. He had mentored him, promoted him, and eventually, David had become Arthur's most trusted advisor. The man he knew would protect the company and its values long after he was gone. David wasn't just an employee. He was like the son they never had. He still called Eleanor every Sunday just to chat, to ask about her garden, to make sure she was okay. He always said, "Arthur saved my life, Ellie. Taking care of you is the least I can do." And in that moment, as the darkness settled outside her window, an idea began to form in Eleanor's mind. It wasn't a plan for revenge. It wasn't a way to get back at the salesman. It was something else. It was about making someone see. It was about reminding a world of shiny, hollow people that the quiet ones, the simple ones, the ones in the old cardigans have value too. She put her empty mug on the side table and stood up. Her heart was beating a little faster, but her hand was steady as she walked to the phone in the hallway. It was an old landline phone, heavy and substantial, not like the flimsy things people carried in their pockets now. She picked up the receiver and dialed the number from memory. She hadn't planned what she was going to say. She only knew she had to say something. It rang twice before a warm, familiar voice answered. "Eleanor. To what do I owe the pleasure? It's a bit late for you to be up, isn't it?" David's voice was full of genuine affection. "Hello, David," she said, her own voice coming out calmer than she expected. "I'm sorry to bother you. You could never bother me," he said instantly. "Is everything all right? You sound a little different." Eleanor took a breath. She told him the story just as it had happened. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't try to make herself sound more pathetic or the salesman more monstrous. She simply described the feeling of being ignored, being led to the corner of the lot like a piece of trash, of hearing the laughter and feeling the shame. She kept her tone matter-of-fact, but as she spoke, the deep disappointment of the day came through in her voice. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. It was a heavy, thoughtful silence. Finally, David spoke, and his voice was no longer light and cheerful. It was low, cold, and dangerously calm. "What was the name of the dealership, Eleanor?" She told him. "Premier Motors, and the man's name." "The one who disrespected you?" "I believe his name was Rick." Another silence. This one felt different. It felt like the calm before a storm. "They disrespected you, Eleanor," David said, his voice tight with a fury that was carefully controlled. "They disrespected everything Arthur stood for. He would be heartbroken to know you were treated that way." "It's not about me, David," Eleanor said softly. "It was just unkind." "It was more than unkind," he corrected her. "It was a failure of their entire business. A failure of character? Don't you worry about a thing. You won't have to go to another dealership. I will handle this. You go and get some rest. I'll call you in the morning." "David, please," she said. "I don't want any trouble." "It's not trouble, Eleanor," he said, and in that moment he sounded so much like Arthur, firm and resolute. "It's just business, and it's about respect. Something they clearly know nothing about. Good night." He hung up the phone. Eleanor stood in the dim hallway for a long moment, the receiver still in her hand. She didn't know what David was going to do, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that something was going to be done. A quiet sense of peace washed over her. She hadn't sought a champion, but one had appeared. She hadn't asked for a battle to be fought on her behalf, but she could hear the armies gathering. She hung up the phone, turned off the hall light, and went to bed. For the first time all day, she felt that things were somehow going to be made right. The men at Premier Motors had no idea that their simple, dismissive act had just set in motion a force they couldn't possibly comprehend. The morning air at Premier Motors was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and cheap cologne. It was just another Wednesday, the midweek rush before the weekend crowds descended. The sales team was gathered in a small, glass-walled office for their daily huddle. Mr. Henderson, the sales manager, a man whose suit was always a little too tight and whose smile never reached his eyes, was pacing back and forth. "Push the warranties, people. That's where the real money is," he was saying, pointing a finger at his team. "We've got quotas to hit. Remember, a car sitting on our lot is a car not making us money. Get them excited, get them signed, get them out the door. Make it happen." The team nodded. A chorus of "You got it, boss, and let's do this." Among them was Rick, who was leaning against the back wall, looking smug. He was retelling the story of his encounter with the old lady from the day before, his voice full of theatrical pity. "Double quotes, ... and I swear she was looking at a brand new sedan." The one with the sunroof. I had to steer her clear, you know, he said, waving his hands for effect. I pointed her toward the back. Told her we had a real classic for her. A real bargain. He paused for effect, a wide grin spreading across his face. She looked like she was going to cry. Best part of my day, honestly? The other salesman laughed, a chorus of easy cruelty. Mr. Henderson chuckled too, clapping Rick on the shoulder. Good thinking, son. Can't waste time on tire kickers. Not when we've got real buyers coming in. You've got a good nose for who's worth our time and who isn't. Keep it up. With that, the meeting broke up and the team dispersed like sharks released into the ocean. The showroom came alive, its bright lights reflecting off the polished hoods of the new cars. The upbeat music started, and the game was on. The salesmen prowled the floor, their eyes scanning for their next target, their smiles perfectly practiced. The incident with the old woman was already forgotten, just another funny story to tell over lunch, the first sign that this was not going to be. A normal day came at 10 minutes past 9. A rumble, much deeper and more powerful than any of the cars on the lot, drew the attention of a few salesmen standing near the entrance. They looked outside to see a procession of 3 identical black SUVs turning into the dealership. They were not the kind of SUVs that families drove to soccer practice. These were massive, armored-looking vehicles, with dark-tinted windows that gave nothing away. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace. Pulling up to the main entrance and stopping in a perfectly straight line, the buzzing energy of the showroom ground to a halt. The loud music suddenly seemed out of place. Salesmen stopped mid-stride. Customers looked up from their brochures. Everyone watched, mesmerized, as the driver of the lead SUV got out. He was a large man in a dark suit with an earpiece and an expression that said he was not to be messed with. He walked around and opened the rear passenger door. The man who stepped out was the complete opposite of everyone in the room. He was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored dark suit. His hair was salt and pepper, neatly combed, and he carried himself with an air of quiet authority that was more powerful than any shout. He was not flashy. He was just... This was David Chen. Behind him, 2 more men in equally sharp suits emerged, along with a 4th man who looked nervous and jovial, holding a leather briefcase. The glass doors slid open, and the group entered the showroom. The silence was now absolute. It felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The man, David, didn't look at the cars. His eyes swept across the faces of the sales team, his gaze neutral, unreadable. It was the look of a man assessing a situation, taking in every detail. Mr. Henderson, seeing the potential for a massive commission, rushed forward, his smile wide and desperate. Welcome. Welcome to Premier Motors, he boomed, his voice echoing in the quiet room. I'm Mr. Henderson, the sales manager. How can I help you today, gentlemen? Are you looking for a fleet, perhaps? We have some excellent corporate packages. David ignored the outstretched hand. He didn't even look at Mr. Henderson. His eyes continued their slow, methodical sweep of the room until they landed on Rick, who was standing near the sedans, his face now pale, his smug grin completely gone. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps something else, passed between them. I'm looking for Mr. Henderson, David said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the entire room. It was a calm, even voice, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command absolute attention. Mr. Henderson, visibly flustered by being ignored, pointed a thumb at his own chest. That's me. David finally turned his full attention to the manager. Yesterday, he began, his voice devoid of any emotion, a woman came to your dealership, an older woman. She was wearing a simple, light-colored cardigan. She was looking for a reliable, used car. Mr. Henderson's brow furrowed in confusion. I'm not sure I recall. A lot of people come through here. She was here, David stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. She was disrespected, treated poorly. By your employee, he said, his eyes flicking towards Rick again. The entire dealership staff, now forming a silent, watching circle, followed his gaze. Rick swallowed hard, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Mr. Henderson started to stammer, trying to get control of the situation. Look, sir, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. My team is trained to be professional." David held up a single hand, and the manager fell silent instantly. "Let me tell you who that woman is," David said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more dangerous. "Her name is Eleanor Vance. Her late husband, Arthur Vance, was the founder of Vanguard Logistics." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. Mr. Henderson's face went blank. Vanguard Logistics was a name everyone in the state knew. It was a massive, powerful shipping and transport company. It was the company that, according to local news, had just secured a multi-billion-dollar statewide contract. David continued, his eyes locked on the manager's. "Mrs. Vance is a quiet, simple woman. She doesn't care about money or status. She cares about respect. Something your dealership, and specifically," he said, looking directly at Rick, "your top salesman, knows absolutely nothing about." The man standing behind David, the nervous one with the briefcase, stepped forward. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Henderson, my name is Alan Porter. I am the regional vice president for the manufacturer." He gestured vaguely at the gleaming cars around them. "The car brand you sell." Mr. Henderson's face went from pale to ashen. Mr. Porter continued, his voice formal and sharp. "Vanguard Logistics is, as of this month, our single largest corporate client in the entire region. They handle all of our vehicle distribution, warehousing, and transport. It's a partnership worth tens of millions of dollars to us. It's a partnership that is the foundation of this dealership's franchise agreement. In fact," he said, looking around the showroom with a look of disdain, "the only reason this dealership exists is because of our relationship with Vanguard." David stepped forward again, taking back control of the conversation. He looked at Mr. Henderson not with anger, but with a profound and chilling disappointment. "You and your employee saw a simple woman and treated her like she was nothing. You failed to see that she represents a legacy of integrity and hard work that your entire organization couldn't hope to comprehend. You judged her by her cardigan, and in doing so, you have insulted the memory of a great man, and you have disrespected a partnership that is the lifeblood of this company." The vice president, Mr. Porter, took his cue. "Effective immediately, I am pulling our entire fleet business from Premier Motors. All corporate accounts are suspended. Furthermore," he said, his voice hardening, "given the evidence of a deeply unprofessional and toxic sales culture, which has now jeopardized our most important corporate relationship, we are launching a full audit of your franchise license. We will be recommending to the board that Vanguard Logistics and all associated accounts be moved permanently to your primary competitor across town." The words hit Mr. Henderson like physical blows. He stumbled back a step. The reality of what was happening was crashing down on him. This wasn't a lost sale. This wasn't an angry customer. This was the end. His business, his career, everything he had built, was being dismantled in front of his entire staff. All because one of his salesmen had been cruel to an old woman he thought was a nobody. The room was frozen in a tableau of utter shock. The salesmen stood motionless, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. The few customers in the showroom were watching, their eyes wide, witnessing a corporate execution. Rick was leaning against a car for support, looking like he was about to be sick. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint, upbeat pop song that still played, now a mocking soundtrack to their ruin. David Chen didn't say another word. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, turned on his heel, and led his team out of the showroom, leaving behind a room full of speechless, shattered men. The next day's arrival had not just left them speechless. It had left them with nothing left to say. The silence that followed the departure of the men in black suits was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, pressing down on everyone in the showroom. The upbeat pop song that had been playing moments before now sounded like a cruel joke. Its cheerful beat a stark contrast to the ashen faces and frozen statures of the sales team. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the nightmare to end, for someone to shout, "Just kidding." But no one did. Mr. Henderson was the first to break the spell, but it wasn't with words. He made a strange, choked sound, a kind of gasping sob, and stumbled backward, his hand flying to his chest as if he'd been shot. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant confidence just an hour ago, was now a sickly, gray color. His eyes, wide and unseeing, darted around the room, landing on the shiny cars, the polished floors, the glass walls of his office, all the symbols of his success that now looked like the props of a ruined stage. He looked at Rick, and the look on his face was not one of anger, but of pure, adulterated horror and accusation. Rick, standing near a sedan, felt the weight of that look like a physical blow. His legs felt like they were made of lead. He had been the king of this showroom just an hour ago, the top salesman, the one who could spot a loser from a mile away. Now he was the architect of its destruction. The smug grin, the casual cruelty, the easy laughter, it all replayed in his mind, but now it wasn't funny. It was a funeral dirge. He saw the face of the old woman, her quiet dignity, the way her eyes had held a deep sadness instead of the anger he had expected. He had seen her as a joke, a waste of his precious time. He had never for a second considered she might be a person who mattered. The other salesmen began to stir slowly, like statues coming to life. They looked at each other, their expressions a mix of fear and shock. Some instinctively backed away from Rick, as if his failure was a contagious disease. One young man, who had been laughing the hardest at Rick's story, now looked at him with a cold, hard fury. "You idiot," he whispered, the words cutting through the thick silence. "You absolute flaming idiot." Mr. Porter, the vice president, hadn't left with David Chen. He had stayed, standing by the entrance like a grim reaper, his briefcase held loosely at his side. Now he walked slowly into the center of the room, his polished shoes clicking softly on the floor. The sound was unnervingly loud. He stopped and looked at Mr. Henderson, who seemed to shrink with each step the man took. "I will need the keys to the general manager's office," Mr. Porter said, his voice crisp and devoid of any emotion. "My team and I will need to secure all financial records, employee files, and client contracts for the audit. Please have all non-essential staff clear the showroom floor immediately."
What?
His words were the final nail in the coffin. This wasn't a threat. It was a procedure. It was happening, right now. Mr. Henderson seemed to crumple in on himself. He fumbled in his pocket for his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip them. He couldn't speak. He just held the keys out, his arm trembling. A young woman from the administrative office, her face pale and tear-streaked, scurried forward to take them from him. This is a mistake," a salesman finally managed to choke out, stepping forward. "It was one guy, one bad apple. You can't punish all of us for this." Mr. Porter turned his cold gaze on the man. "The issue, as I see it, is not one bad apple. The issue is the orchard. Your manager's laughter was just as loud as this young man's," he said, nodding toward Rick. "The culture of disrespect was on display for everyone to see. This dealership represents our brand, and frankly, we are disgusted. Now, as I said, clear the floor." The threat of being fired was enough to break the final spell. The sales team, along with the few bewildered customers, began to shuffle out of the showroom, moving like zombies. They gathered in small groups in the parking lot, their voices low and frantic, watching through the glass as their world was being packed up in boxes. Inside, Mr. Porter and his assistants, who had appeared from nowhere, began their methodical work, efficiently shutting down the dealership's operations. Inside the chaos, Rick stood alone. No one would look at him. No one would speak to him. He was a ghost in his own graveyard. He finally managed to move his feet, and he walked like a man in a trance, toward the service bay, where the old, rejected cars were kept. He stood at the edge of the lot, looking at the beat-up compact he had led the old woman to. He saw the peeling paint, the cracked dashboard. He saw his own reflection in the grimy window, a pale, pathetic, hollowed-out version of the confident salesman he was that morning. He had thought he was so smart, so powerful, able to judge a person's worth with a single glance. He had never understood that power wasn't about making someone feel small. It was about the ability to lift someone up. And he had just watched the most powerful person he had ever met use his strength to defend a woman who had none. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, acidic burn in his throat. He sank to the ground on the asphalt, putting his head in his hands, and for the first time in a very long time, he cried. Meanwhile, in a small, quiet garden across town, Eleanor was tending to her roses. She was snipping away the deadheads, her movements gentle and practiced. The morning sun was warm on her back, and the air smelled of earth and blooming flowers. She was thinking about Arthur, and the way he used to say that a garden was a lesson in patience. You can't force a rose to bloom. You just have to give it what it needs and trust that it will. She felt a sense of deep, abiding peace. The story of David's visit to the dealership was not hers to tell. It was David's. She had simply set the truth in motion and let it find its own way. Her phone rang, its cheerful trill cutting through the quiet morning. She wiped her dirt-smudged hands on her apron and went inside to answer it. It was David. His voice was warm and calm, the cold fury from the night before completely gone. "It's done, Eleanor," he said. "The manager has been fired. The sales rep, who was so rude to you, I believe he's reconsidering his career choices. The dealership's future is, to put it mildly, uncertain. Justice, I think, has been served." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, a soft smile touching her lips. "I'm sorry it had to come to that, David." "Don't be," he said firmly. "Some people only understand the language of consequences. It's a shame, but it's the truth. Now, let's talk about you. You need a car. Don't argue with me. I've already made a few calls." He explained that he had reached out to a man he knew, a fellow businessman who owned a small family-run dealership on the other side of town. "Good people," David assured her. "Arthur would have liked them. They're expecting you. No pressure. Just go, take a look, and see what you think." Eleanor agreed, her heart feeling lighter than it had in days. As she hung up the phone, she felt no sense of triumph or victory. She just felt a quiet rightness. The men at Premier Motors had treated her like she was worthless. The world had shown them, in the clearest possible terms, just how wrong they were. It wasn't about money or power. It was about respect. It was about the simple, profound truth that every single person, no matter what they wear or how much money they have, deserves to be treated with kindness. And that was a lesson worth teaching no matter the cost. She had learned a lesson too. She had learned that even a simple woman, when she stands on the side of respect, can move mountains. She picked up her handbag, straightened her simple cardigan, and prepared to go find her new car. Eleanor did not witness the fallout at Premier Motors. The news of the dealership's sudden spectacular collapse would spread through the community like wildfire in the coming days, becoming a local legend, a cautionary tale told in break rooms and over family dinners. But for Eleanor, that story was not hers to watch unfold. Her part in it was over. The morning after her call to David, she found a sense of peace she hadn't felt since her old car had died on that busy street. The world had righted itself, not through anger or revenge, but through a simple, powerful act of accountability. Around mid-morning, a gentle knock came at her front door. It was not a loud, demanding knock, but a soft, respectful one. Eleanor opened it to find a man standing on her porch, a small, friendly smile on his face. He was in his late 50s, with kind eyes and a slightly rumpled sport coat. He looked less like a car salesman and more like someone's favorite uncle, Mrs. Vance. He asked, his voice warm and pleasant. "My name is Thomas. I own Miller Family Autos. David Chen asked me to stop by." Eleanor smiled and invited him in. He declined, not wanting to impose, but accepted the glass of iced tea she offered him on the porch swing. Thomas spoke not of cars at first, but of her husband. It turned out Arthur had done business with Miller's Auto Parts, Thomas's father's shop, long before his logistics company had become a giant. Thomas remembered Arthur as a man who always paid on time and always asked about his family. They sat for nearly an hour, sharing stories of Arthur, of the old days, of the town they both loved. It was a conversation, not a sales pitch. Finally, Thomas gently brought up the reason for his visit. "David told me what happened," he said, his expression sad. "Frankly, I was ashamed. That's not how we do business. It's certainly not how Arthur would have wanted people to be treated. He explained that a brand new, top-of-the-line sedan was sitting on his lot. Paid for, with Eleanor's name on the papers? It's the least we can do, Mrs. Vance. A formal apology from our community. Eleanor listened patiently, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she shook her head gently, a soft but firm gesture. Thomas, that is very kind. More than kind. But I cannot accept such a gift. He started to protest, but she held up a hand, just as David had done the day before. Arthur didn't raise me to expect handouts, she said with a small smile. He raised me to be fair. What I need is a reliable car, and I am perfectly willing to pay a fair price for one. That's all. Thomas looked at her, and a look of deep respect entered his eyes. He saw now why David had been so fiercely protective of this woman. She wasn't just a victim. She was a pillar of quiet strength. He nodded slowly. All right, Mrs. Vance, I understand. But you will let me give you a very, very good deal. And you will let me make sure it is the safest and most reliable car on my lot. It's a compromise we'll have to make. She agreed, and they drove to his lot in his own car. Miller Family Autos was everything Premier Motors was not. It was a small, tidy lot, well kept but not flashy. The cars were clean and looked cared for. There was no loud music, no thrumming energy, just a couple of friendly people sitting at desks inside a small, cozy office. Thomas didn't walk her to the most expensive car. He walked her to a modest 3-year-old sedan. It was a simple, practical car, much like her old one. It was a trade-in from a little old lady, just like you, he said with a wink. She only drove it to church and the grocery store. It's in perfect condition. Eleanor took it for a test drive. It was comfortable, the controls were simple, and it hummed along quietly. It felt right. Back at the dealership, they sat at his desk. He showed her the price, and it was indeed an exceptionally fair one. She didn't haggle. She simply nodded and wrote him a check from her own account, a check that covered the car in full. As he handed her the keys, Thomas said, You know, Mrs. Vance, you remind me of my mother. She always said that dignity was something you carry inside you, and no one could take it away unless you let them. You didn't let them. Eleanor looked at the keys in her hand, a simple, unadorned set of keys for a simple, reliable car. No, she said softly. I didn't. She drove home in her new car, the windows down, the warm air blowing through her hair. She felt no sense of victory. She didn't feel the need to call her son and tell him what had happened to the men at Premier Motors. The satisfaction she felt was not a loud, cheering thing. It was a quiet, deep-seated peace. It was the feeling of a balance restored in the days that followed. The story of what happened at Premier Motors became the talk of the town. Eleanor heard snippets of it here and there, at the grocery store, from her neighbor, during her book club. The dealership had been put up for sale, its franchise revoked. The manager and several staff had been fired. The young salesman Rick had reportedly left town, his reputation in tatters. People spoke of the story in hushed, amazed tones, as if it were a modern-day fable. They talked about the mysterious billionaire who had swept in to defend an old woman's honor. When Eleanor heard these stories, she just smiled to herself. They were all missing the point. It wasn't really about the money or the power. It was about a choice. The men at Premier Motors had chosen to disrespect her because they thought she was powerless. David had chosen to defend her because he valued character over appearance. And she, Eleanor, had chosen to respond not with anger, but with a simple, quiet request for respect. She saw Rick once a few weeks later. She was parked downtown, waiting for a friend, and she saw him walking down the street. He had lost the sharp suit and the slicked-back hair. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, and he looked thinner, his shoulders slumped. He was just a young man now, not a predator. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. He looked away quickly, his face a mask of shame. Eleanor didn't feel anger or even satisfaction. She just felt a profound sadness for him. She hoped for his sake that he had learned a lesson that would last him the rest of his life. She hoped he had learned that everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle, that a little kindness costs nothing. Life went back to its simple rhythm. Eleanor drove her new car to her garden club meetings and to the doctor. She drove out on weekends to see her grandchildren, who loved the roomy back seat. The car became a part of her life, a tool, not a treasure. It was reliable and safe, and that was all she had ever wanted. One evening, she was sitting on her porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. She was thinking about Arthur. She missed him every single day, but she was no longer lonely. His presence was all around her in the roses, in the quiet strength of her own heart, and in the simple, unshakable knowledge that her life, and the legacy he left behind, still mattered. She was, and always had been, a simple woman. But simplicity, she was beginning to understand, was not about how much you owned or how little you had. It was about knowing what was truly important: respect, dignity, and kindness. And in a world that often valued flash over substance, she had carried those values like a lantern, a quiet light that had, for one day, illuminated a great darkness. And that, she thought, as the first star appeared in the twilight sky, was more than enough.